It had rained sometime in the early hours. Not a storm, not even a downpour. Just the sort of modest drizzle Oxford does best, enough to darken the stone and bring the scent of lichen out from the colleges. I remember sitting outside a cafe near Magdalen Tower, coat collar turned up, cup half drunk and cooling beside me. A man of routine might have called it breakfast, but I've never been one for routine. I was pretending to finish a crossword, although the paper had long since gone limp in the mist, the clues bleeding at the edges like secrets poorly kept. It was just before 7 when the bells began. I wasn't watching the time, but one learns to feel such things. The anticipation that builds just before the chimes ring out over the city. First, the familiar deep tones of Great Tom, then the rolling peal that tumbles from tower to tower, like a sequence of reluctant confessions. And yet that morning, something struck me. Or rather, didn't. The absence was subtle, a silence within sound. The smallest bell from Magdalen Misericord never joined the chorus. Most would not notice. It rings but once a day, and even then faintly, like the echo of a whisper down a corridor. But I heard its absence. I always have. I told myself it was nothing. Maintenance, a broken rope, a sleeping bell ringer. Yet something about the omission unsettled me. A note unplayed in an otherwise perfect phrase. Still, I had no cause to investigate a missing chime, and I wasn't about to invent one. So I sat, watched the mist shift across High Street, and tried to decipher a smudged clue. 7 letters, third letter E. Something to do with betrayal. Too obvious to be treason. Too literal. I left it blank. A student passed by, headphones in, unaware of any bells or silences. He dropped a newspaper on the next table, perhaps mistaking me for someone who might care about headlines. I rarely do. But I glanced. Some habit of mine, blame it on boredom or instinct. The two often wear the same coat. The article was small, near the bottom of the page. No photograph, no scandal. College secretary found dead in office, natural causes suspected. The college was St. Bellamy's. Quiet, modest, forgettable. A woman in her late 60s, Beatrice Lonsdale. No signs of struggle. Office door locked. File drawers are neat. The teacup is untouched. Natural causes. I've always hated the phrase. So confidently vague. So easily accepted. Death rarely announces itself so tidily, especially not in Oxford, where even the ghosts wear academic gowns and quote Tennyson. I folded the paper, slowly, almost ceremonially. There was a mark in the margin beside the article, a tiny ink dot, nothing more. Perhaps the previous reader's pen had bled. Perhaps not. Perhaps a warning. Perhaps I needed another coffee. I rose without deciding to, left coins on the saucer, and began walking east. The city was still waking. Shop fronts shuttered, bicycles damp from the rain, the smell of wet stone rising like a memory no one had asked for. The bells had stopped by then. The silence had returned to its usual self. It wasn't a case, not yet. There were no cries for help, no suspicious bruises, no whispered phone calls in the night, just a dead woman in an office and a bell that had chosen not to ring. But I've learned, over the years, to listen to absences, to silence within sounds, to the space between the chimes. And on that morning, Oxford felt too quiet by one note. It was Lewis who insisted on the lift. He had that look about him, the one he wears when he thinks I've forgotten a detail and refuses to say it aloud. He waited beside the car, keys jangling in his palm like a nervous schoolboy rattling change. I didn't protest. The walk to St. Bellamy's was short, but the day already had a dampness to it that seemed to seep in through the seams of one's thoughts. St. Bellamy's isn't one of the grand colleges. No postcard arches or grand quadrangles. It sits quietly just north of the parks, hemmed in by climbing ivy and the remnants of decisions made in better-funded decades. A college that has grown shy with age. That morning it was quieter than usual, as if the stones themselves were trying not to draw attention. They showed us to the office without ceremony. No apologetic steward, no shuffling of keys. Just an administrative corridor that smelled faintly of tea and typewriter ribbon. I stepped inside first. I remember pausing at the threshold, though I couldn't tell you why. Perhaps it was the light, a slanting grey that fell through Venetian blinds like failed intentions. The room was impossibly neat. Not merely tidy, but composed, every paper squarely stacked, no signs of frantic work or interrupted thought. Her handbag sat closed beside the filing cabinet. Not a key out of place, not a paperclip astray. It felt like the inside of a music box after the lid has closed and the tune has ended. Beatrice Lonsdale had worked here for 34 years. A woman, I was told, of great administrative precision, rarely absent, never impolite. Her body had been found slumped over the desk, head resting lightly on the blotter, as if she drifted off while checking bursarial figures. I imagined the porter knocking, waiting too long, then unlocking the door with practiced reluctance. There were no signs of violence. That's what the college insisted. Heart failure, most likely. The GP agreed. An officer had been called, forms filled, the body removed. Routine, untroubled, except I don't believe in tidy deaths. Not in Oxford, not behind locked doors and unopened windows. Lewis said something about her age, about the strain of a lifetime's clerical servitude. I nodded, but my attention was elsewhere. The teacup beside the phone, perfectly empty. Not a stain inside, not even the memory of steam, and the saucer, untouched. No ring, no teaspoon, just porcelain, dry and certain. She'd begun writing something. A note, perhaps, or the tail end of a list. It was half-scrawled on the blotter, ink trailing into nothing. The bell. And then nothing more. Not even a full stop to mark the end. That was what stayed with me, even more than the stillness of the chair or the untouched cardigan folded neatly on the armrest behind her. Lewis had wandered out to speak to the porter again. I remained, staring at the desk. Something about the room had the feeling of having been arranged. Not in haste, not to deceive, but to control. A kind of preparation. The sort of detail that suggests not accident, but choreography. On the windowsill, behind the thin curtain, was a single feather. Downy grey, lodged against the latch. Nothing remarkable in that, perhaps. But this was a sealed room, they'd said. No birds, no breeze. I didn't touch it. I stepped back from the desk, careful not to disturb anything. I don't know why. She was gone. But still, it felt like trespass. I murmured something about paperwork to the constable in the corridor and left. As we exited, I heard the chapel bell ring the hour. Clean, clear, and free of mourning. I waited for misericord. It did not come. Back in the car, Lewis asked if I believed it was natural. I said nothing. He nodded like a man reassured. But I was still thinking of the unfinished sentence. The bell. The missing sound. The room is too careful in its silence. And somewhere behind all of it, the sense that something once hidden was beginning, very faintly, to ring. There is a particular quiet to Oxford cloisters on a grey afternoon, a silence not of absence, but of memory. Footsteps echo longer, voices carry farther, and the rain, when it falls, doesn't splash so much as whisper along the flagstones. It was under such a sky that I walked the quadrangle of St. Bellamy's, my coat damp at the shoulders, my thoughts somewhere between the half-formed and the long-forgotten. The college porter's keys jingled behind me like a reluctant chaperone. I let him talk. Porters always know more than they admit, and less than they think. He recited Beatrice Lonsdale's schedule with the precision of someone who measured worth in appointments and tea breaks. She'd arrived early, as always, taken no calls, left the outer door bolted. A creature of habit, he called her, as though habits were sufficient company in one's final hours. The fellows were gathered in the senior common room, a chamber of book-laden silence where tea-urns hissed with polite menace. Introductions came and went, names that sounded like footnotes in forgotten journals, but it was Dr. Elaine Fallows who lingered. She stood apart from the others, neither deferent nor dismissive. A woman in her early 50s, sharp-featured, dry-voiced, with a pair of glasses that never quite hid the way her eyes seemed to calculate each exchange. She said she'd worked alongside Beatrice for over a decade, trusted her, admired her even. I asked what the secretary had been working on that week. She told me it was college endowment matters, grant allocations, something about deferred maintenance in the old bell tower. I made a note of that. Not on paper, but somewhere between the unfinished sentence and the missing chime. Then, unprovoked, she corrected a misquotation of "Don I hadn't yet spoken aloud. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls." Her voice carried an edge. Not scorn, not quite. A kind of wearied familiarity, the kind you find between people who once admired one another and stopped just short of liking each other. When I left the room, Lewis was already chatting with a junior lecturer near the chapel. Something about his tone made me pause. I watched, half listening. The young man was bright, eager, too quick to disclaim intimacy with the deceased. He said something curious, that Beatrice used to take her lunch in the bell tower, alone, always the same hour, a sandwich, a thermos, sometimes a book. I asked what book. He shrugged. He wasn't certain. Something about church architecture, or maybe poetry. Possibly both. I stood for a while at the edge of the quad. Rain gathered in the dips of worn flagstones. The clock struck 3. Once, twice, clear as glass. But again, Misericord remained silent. A bell too small to be missed, too persistent not to be. The tower loomed above me, unassuming, patched with moss, its windows shuttered against the rain. I made a mental note to return, not with ceremony, quietly, alone. A gardener passed by, nodding toward me as he swept wet leaves into a rusting bin. He said she was kind. Beatrice said she once brought him biscuits at Christmas. No fuss, just a white paper bag left beside the wheelbarrow, the kind of gesture that doesn't appear in eulogies. I thanked him, though I'm not sure why. Perhaps because he seemed the only honest voice I'd heard all afternoon. Back in the porter's office, I asked for the college's archive ledger. A thought had arrived, uninvited, untested, that Beatrice had kept something for herself. Not stolen, but preserved, the way one might press a leaf between pages or underline a line of verse. A hidden echo of some earlier event. Lewis asked if I thought the bell had anything to do with her death. I told him I wasn't sure, but some silences are shaped like bells, ringing inwards, waiting to be heard again. It was the kind of rain that doesn't fall, but lingers, a fine mist that sits on the skin like breath and makes everything seem slightly out of focus. I had returned to St. Bellamy's not for answers, but for paper. Paper has always been more honest than people, and the visitor's register, with its faded ink and unforgiving dates, seemed as good a place to begin as any. The college porter, a man who looked as though he'd been preserved in varnish, handed over the ledger with a slight flourish, as though it were a chalice rather than a record of polite comings and goings. I nodded, murmured thanks, and took it to a low table in the antechamber that smelled faintly of polish and old tea leaves. The entries were uniform, names neatly printed, times recorded with clerical precision, alumni, visiting scholars, occasional dignitaries. Then, half a page down, written with a hand that had once been confident and now seemed to falter. J.F. Ambrose. The name rang something in me. Not a bell, not yet, but the memory of one. Poet, minor, faded. Not unreadable, just unread. I closed the book slowly. I don't know why it struck me as significant. Perhaps because the signature was just a little too careful, or perhaps because Ambrose had been here the day before Beatrice died. And perhaps because on the shelf in her office, tucked among bursarial records and committee minutes, I'd seen one of his volumes, Echoes and Silence, its spine faded but uncracked. I asked Lewis if he'd heard of the man. He hadn't, though he offered to look him up. I declined. Some things need to be approached with dust on them. Ambrose, as it turned out, was giving a reading that evening at the Sheldonian, part of some minor poetry circuit revival. I've never cared much for poetic evenings and less for poetic revivals, but I found myself at the back of the hall just before dusk. The room was half filled with the kind of audience that still wore scarves indoors and listened with their chins raised slightly, as if verse were a scent they were trying to place. Ambrose stood at the lectern, older than I expected. Slighter. He read well in the way men do who know they've not been listened to in a long time. His voice caught once, during a line about bells tolling inwardly, and I saw his hand tremble slightly. It was the tremble that made me certain. He knew something. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to be afraid of it. After the reading, I approached under the guise of misplaced admiration. He seemed wary but flattered. That, too, I filed away. I asked if he had known Beatrice Lonsdale. He tilted his head as though tasting the name. Said he might have. Said the name was familiar. Said a great many things. I asked about his visit to St. Bellamy's. He smiled. Something to do with college archives. Research, nostalgia. I let him speak. People often tell the truth when they think they're lying artfully. Then he misquoted Yeats. Only by a word. Tread for trod. But it was enough. Enough to suggest he hadn't read the poem recently. Or perhaps that someone else had quoted it to him and he'd remembered it imperfectly. Either way, it was the kind of slip that betrays more than it intends. I left him there, surrounded by wine glasses and admirers with lined notebooks and faint hopes of being remembered. On my way out, I noticed a single folded page resting on an empty chair. Someone had copied a stanza from one of Ambrose's poems, the ink still wet. I read it once, then again. It spoke of silence, not as absence, but as choice. Outside, the mist had thickened. The city glistened like it had been rinsed clean, though nothing ever truly is. I lit a cigarette I didn't want, simply for the warmth of it, and thought of Beatrice's bookshelf, the unread spine, the half-finished note, a name in a register, a tremble in a voice, a word misremembered. Sometimes a clue doesn't ring out, it just lingers. Waiting. The college archive sits beneath the chapel, an accident of design or perhaps the result of a long-forgotten intention. Damp stone, uneven steps, and the persistent scent of iron and vellum. A room no one rushes into, and from which one emerges with something slightly altered in the gate. I'd been there before. Years ago. Different case, same silence. I asked the archivist, a man who looked like he had once been tall and had shrunk thoughtfully over time, for anything pertaining to the bell tower or to its former caretaker, one Thomas Kersey. The name brought a pause, not quite long enough to be suspicious, but just enough to mark a hesitation. He vanished behind the rolling stacks with a nod, leaving me alone with dust and filing cabinets that hummed faintly in the electricity. The file he returned with was slender. Kersey had been the college's bell ringer for over 20 years, blind since 19, scholar of medieval liturgies turned caretaker of sound. I remembered the obituary vaguely. A quiet man, found at the base of the tower steps one winter morning. A fall, they said. These things happen, they said. But there had always been a tone to the story, something unsaid beneath the pastoral condolences. Tucked into the folder between salary receipts and brittle certificates was a letter. The envelope was yellowed, unsealed, addressed in ink that had begun to soften around the edges. Miss Beatrice Lonsdale, college secretary. The date, 5 days before Kersey's death. I didn't read it immediately. I held it, as though the weight of it might suggest intention, but eventually, curiosity, or perhaps something quieter, made me unfold the page. The handwriting was deliberate, as one might expect from someone who could not see what they wrote. Beatrice, a bell tolls only when guilt outweighs silence. Beware who controls the silence. I know now that I was not mistaken. The bell in the tower carries more than sound. It carries memory. And memory, if it is honest, is rarely kind. I have said nothing for too long. There is a document hidden. You will know where. It was never mine to withhold. I'm afraid, but fear is a poor companion at the end. Do not let them ring the hour without knowing the debt. It was unsigned. It didn't need to be. I folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. The archivist asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I said I had. He nodded, satisfied in the way men are when they don't ask what specifically that was. I crossed the quad alone. The chapel bell rang the hour. Again, misericord was silent. Later, I returned to the tower. I had no key, but the porter had left one behind his desk, as though some part of him assumed correctly that I would come. The lock resisted, but relented. The door opened on a sigh. The stairs were narrow and bowed with time. Each one creaked like an admission. The air grew colder as I climbed, the light thinner. At the top, the belfry opened like a throat. There were 4 bells. 3 hung proud and still. 1, smaller, darker with age, hung without a rope. The end of the severed line lay curled like a question on the floorboards. I did not touch it. Instead, I moved slowly around the perimeter. The stone here had not been cleaned in decades. There was a narrow ledge beside the frame, shielded from sight by the curve of the masonry. It took time and a touch of improvised contortion, but eventually my hand found what I hadn't known I was searching for, a piece of vellum folded in quarters, tied with a thread. No seal. Inside, a hand-drawn staff of music. 5 lines, bare but for a single clef and a notation beneath it. I heard no bell, yet knew the hour. I stood there a long time, as the rain had begun again, faint but persistent. It drummed on the lead roof above me like distant applause or penance. I did not understand the music. Not then. But something about the line stayed with me. Not because it made sense, but because it didn't. When I descended, I locked the tower behind me. Back at my desk, I opened the crossword again. The clue from earlier lingered. 7 letters. Betrayal. 3rd letter E. I tried silence. It fit. I wasn't sure if that meant anything. But sometimes, the act of fitting is enough. Some names return like a faint bell heard through stone. You don't remember the sound at first, only the sensation of having once known it. Edmund Vale was such a name. It came to me not through evidence, but insinuation. Beatrice's niece, a quiet woman in an ochre coat with hands too still for her age, brought me a folder of her aunt's papers, mostly mundane. Schedules, letters from funding boards, a half-solved crossword folded in quarters, and a note, unsigned, unposted, in Beatrice's familiar, meticulous script. Mr. Vale has requested another meeting. I do not relish it, that was all. Vale had been an alumnus. I remembered him vaguely, not for any academic brilliance, but for the controversy that trailed behind him like wet leaves on a shoe. Expulsion in '78. Plagiarism, they said. Or perhaps it was something quieter, more reputationally convenient. Kersey's name had come up in connection with it, and then had been buried again, quickly, as these things tend to be. I found Vale in London, civil servant, mid-tier, the sort of man who wore suits a decade out of date and made them seem deliberate. His office overlooked nothing in particular. The windows were clean. He asked what brought me. I said I was following a death. Beatrice Lonsdale. I watched his face as the name landed. No startle, but no ease either. A slight narrowing of the eyes. Not enough to convict a man, but enough to suggest a memory had been dislodged. He said he'd heard. Said it was a shame. A heart, wasn't it? She always struck him as brittle, but dependable. He said it like someone might say a grandfather clock had finally stopped ticking. Inconvenient, but inevitable. I asked if he'd met her recently. He admitted to it, eventually. Just a few times. Old connections, something about revisiting benefactions. The college wanted to refurbish the bell tower, he said. Beatrice had reached out. or perhaps he had. He couldn't recall. That ambiguity lingered too long to be believable. He glanced at his watch while I asked. A habit, maybe, or a sign. I asked about Kersey. He exhaled, slowly, said he hadn't thought of that name in years, that Kersey had been a stern tutor. Rigid, unforgiving, a man of dogma. He used the word impractical, which struck me as peculiar for someone who had spent his life ringing bells. Then Vale added softly that he'd always suspected Kersey of hiding behind his blindness. Not in ability, but in morality. I made a note of that too. It was something in his phrasing, too rehearsed, too detached, that nudged at me. He called Kersey a cautionary figure. No one says that unless they believe they've become the opposite. I asked what had really happened in 1978. He said nothing for a long while. Then he smiled, lightly. Said he'd been young. That ambition can be untidy. That history is rarely generous with its footnotes. I asked again if Kersey had been wronged. Vale only said, "Some men deserve to be forgotten." I left shortly after. He offered his hand. It was cold, dry, firm in the way men are taught to be when they want to seem unafraid. I didn't shake it. Back in Oxford, the bells rang 5 as I crossed the quad. All but misericord. Still silent. Still withholding. I stopped outside the chapel and looked back toward the porter's lodge. For a moment, I thought of Beatrice. Her hand on the bell rope, her gaze fixed on a past that had never been fully buried. She had met Vale. More than once. And not for charity. There had been something else. Something owed. Something feared. At my desk that night, I unfolded the crossword she had left unfinished. A 5-letter clue stared up at me. Fall from grace. The answer came too easily. Exile. It fit, though I doubted she had written it. It was late when the knock came. Not at my front door, but in that strange half-dreaming hour when time softens around the edges and everything feels a degree removed. Lewis had returned from his visit to Beatrice's flat with a cardboard box and a face that suggested he hadn't wanted to bring either. Inside were the usual relics of the quietly lived, dried-out pens, old payslips, a hairbrush with more memory than bristle. There was a photograph of the St. Bellamy's quad, taken at dusk, annotated on the back in that same neat hand. Michaelmas Fog, 1984. But it was the small black book at the bottom of the box that held us both still. A diary, leather-bound, laced with a faded ribbon, tied once, tightly. No lock, no clasp, just the unmistakable air of something not meant to be read. I untied it, slowly, without remark. The pages were filled with lines, but not words, not at first glance. Symbols, dots and slashes, segments of Latin, interspersed with what looked like shorthand, though it resisted recognition. At one point, a stave of musical notation, but without any key. Just the hint of melody and abstraction. Lewis squinted over my shoulder and said something about codes. I said nothing. The silence felt more informative. Back at the station, I sat alone. Not in the interview rooms, but in my office, with the blinds drawn and the desk lamp giving just enough light to chase meaning. I found myself reading it the way one might read a poem in a language half forgotten, not for narrative, but for rhythm. Repetition. Theme. On the 7th page, in ink that had begun to fade to the color of bruised sky, she had written, "Only a bell unstruck remembers the crime." The line stood alone. Underneath it, a musical rest. Then, elsewhere, he struck twice. Once in words, once in silence. And further still, I keep the bell silent, but the toll gathers in the walls. I remembered the smear of dust on the window ledge, the single feather, the teacup has no stain, things that didn't quite misbehave but stood quietly out of tune. The diary had no dates, no entries marked by event. It was as if it had been written not to remember days, but to trap meanings. The difference is subtle but essential. One is a record, the other is a warning. I turned a page and found, tucked at the center fold, a pressed petal. Blue, crinkled, perhaps cornflower. I'm not sure. She had written beneath it in minute script, the bell and the flower, both left unwatered. What struck me most wasn't the metaphor. It was the pairing, bells and flowers, sound and color, two things that, when denied, leave absences too quiet for words. Lewis returned with a sandwich I hadn't asked for, and a look that suggested I ought to eat it. I set it aside and asked if he'd ever seen Beatrice at the chapel. He said once or twice, never during service. Usually when it was empty. I asked if she sang. He said no, not that he knew of. I thought of the notation in the diary. A treble clef, a dotted minim followed by a line of silence. Not music, but memory. Encoded, not in melody, but in pause. The last page of the book was blank, save for a single letter in the center. V. Not centered, not ornate. Just there, as though it had waited long enough. It meant nothing, or everything. And the more I stared at it, the more I wondered if Beatrice had left a trail, not for discovery, but for containment. A diary that kept her silence from becoming someone else's noise. I closed the book, gently, as one might fold a note never sent. There are photographs that lie, and then there are photographs that forget. The one in the dining hall of St. Bellamy's did a little of both. It hung in a thin gilt frame, off level by no more than a breath, just enough to irritate the symmetry of a trained eye. A graduating class, 1973 or 74, in stiff academic dress, arranged in obedient rows. You'd think the lives in it had all marched forward with the same sense of order. I noticed her immediately, not because she was central or prominent, quite the opposite. Beatrice Lonsdale stood slightly to the side, near the edge of the middle row. Her expression was not one of discomfort, but detachment. The others smiled the way people smile when asked to for posterity. She did not. She looked leftward, not at the camera, not quite at the man beside her either. Past him, perhaps, or inward. Behind her, two figures. Kersey, unmistakable even then. Tall, hollow-cheeked, and serious in the way that seems etched into the bone. And to his left, Ambrose. Younger, with a sharpness to his jawline and a diffidence to his posture that I hadn't recognized in the man I'd spoken 2 days earlier. And beside them, near the back, half concealed by the black sleeves of a taller colleague, was a fourth. Elaine Fallows. No smile either, but hers was intentional. Not absent, simply withheld. It was the arrangement that drew me in, not the faces, the spacing, the way Beatrice's shoulder just missed Kersey's, the fractional gap between Ambrose and the others, as though he had either arrived too late or stood a little apart on purpose. These are things a camera doesn't intend to capture. They slip in by mistake, or perhaps not a mistake, perhaps design. I stood there longer than I meant to. I could feel the weight of the frame through the air. Portraits have that sometimes, a kind of gravitational pull, as if they remember more than we do. The dining hall was empty except for a fellow in tweed who wandered in to retrieve a forgotten umbrella. He nodded to me, the way people do when unsure whether you belong, then paused beside the photograph. She was never supposed to be in it, he said suddenly. I asked who. Lonsdale? She wasn't faculty. Just admin, but Kersey insisted. Said she'd sat in on enough tutorials to earn her place. Bit of a scandal, if you believe the old stories. I asked what kind. The kind that doesn't go in handbooks. Some said she was involved in the review board that looked into a student's plagiarism case. Vale, I said. He nodded, slowly. Yes, Vale. Not many remember him now. Bright, difficult. Kersey fought hard for him. Too hard, maybe. And Beatrice? Hard to say. She was discreet, but there were rumors. She and Kersey were close once. Or not. It's always difficult to know with people like her. She never wore her life where others could see it. After he left, I stood again before the frame and followed her gaze. Not with my eyes, but with something else. She wasn't looking at Kersey, or Vale, or the photographer. She was looking at someone not pictured. Someone who had stood just out of frame either by accident or intention, or she wasn't looking at anyone at all. Back in my office, I stared at the photograph once more, now flattened under the light of a copier, reduced to pixels and toner. But something lingered. I ran my thumb along the edge where her shoulder touched the margin. There was something protective in her posture, something reserved. Lewis asked if I thought the scandal from the 70s had anything to do with her death. I said it was never really about the scandal. It was about who remembered it, and who didn't. That night I sat with the crossword again. 4 letters. Clue, unspoken longing. I tried ache, too obvious, then hush, too coy. I settled on look. It fit, if imperfectly. The bell tower isn't a place built for a company. It's built for weight, wind, and waiting. Even in daylight it feels like dusk, stone that never warms, wood that never creaks in comfort. I returned alone, though I hadn't planned to. It was one of those decisions the body makes before the mind agrees, a kind of muscle memory that belongs to instinct rather than intention. The stairs up had grown steeper, though I suspect they had not changed. It was I who had. Each turn in the spiral had the feel of rehearsal, the kind of walk one makes not to discover, but to face what was already known. Beatrice had climbed these steps, or tried to. The diary hadn't said it, not in so many words, but it had implied it, in symbols and rests and phrases that fluttered just shy of confession. At the top, the light had gone milk grey. Fog pressed against the leaded glass like a held breath. I stood in the center of the room and listened. Not for sound, but for something quieter. The bells hung motionless above me, monolithic and indifferent. All but Misericord, the smallest, the one who had not spoken in days. Its rope was gone. Not frayed, not unknotted. Gone, removed as if deliberately. The gap where it had once dropped down to the chamber floor now gaped open, a clean void, the sort that doesn't happen by time or accident. I knelt, not with reverence, but necessity. There, against the edge of the beam, I found the end of a copper wire. Thin, bent, cut. It had been wrapped around the rope at some point. Not recently. Perhaps months ago, perhaps years. A trick of tension, perhaps. To make the bell fail only under certain conditions, or simply to mark it for silence. I sat on the bench by the east-facing window, warped now, the lead lines bleeding slightly where time had pushed the frame outward. The city lay hidden behind mist. All I could see was the chapel roof, the slate glistening like old ink. There had been no sign of struggle in Beatrice's office. No spilt tea, no overturned chair. But there had been an intention, a note half-written, a teacup too clean, a lock turned from the inside. And she had known something, not a fact, not an event, but a shape of something. Something she feared would be forgotten, or perhaps something she feared would return. I reached into my coat pocket. I'd brought Ambrose's book again, Echoes and Silence. I hadn't opened it since the reading, but I had remembered the line. A verse buried deep in the 3rd section. I plucked the rope to stop the knell, lest memory ring from living shell. It had struck me then as overwrought, but now, up here, in the quiet above the stones, it seemed less like poetry and more like confession. Not literal, not direct, but shaped like truth. Ambrose had been in Oxford. He had seen Beatrice. Vale had returned, too, under the guise of funding meetings, and Fallows. She had remained all along, a triangle or a circle. I wasn't sure. But each one had touched something that Kersey had once tried to preserve. Or bury. I set the book down beside me and looked again at the smallest bell. Misericord, a name that meant mercy, or, in some traditions, a small dagger given to end the suffering of the fallen. It was never rung for a ceremony, only for the final hour. I wondered if Beatrice had planned to ring it, not in defiance, not as accusation, but as release. A tool to mark something finished, perhaps for Kersey, perhaps for herself. And someone had known. The sound of footsteps broke the air. Lewis, cautious on the stairs. He called my name once. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for the folded page from her diary, the one marked with a stave of music. I turned it slowly, studying the clef, the spacing, the absence of notes. Only one mark remained. A rest held for 4 beats. A silence, measured. Lewis reached the top, breath visible in the cold. He asked what I'd found. I said the bell had been silenced long before Beatrice died. He asked if that meant someone had known what she would do. I said no. I said it meant someone had known what she had already done. There are confessions that shout, and there are those that arrive in silence, already bruised by the telling. Ambrose's came somewhere between the two, wrapped not in apology, but in cadence. It was not a courtroom admission, it was a poem. Of course it was. He had agreed, reluctantly, to meet me again. The reading at the Bodleian had been well attended, rows of corduroy shoulders and folded hands, the air thick with the smell of old bindings and coffee from the lobby kiosk. Ambrose read with a calm that didn't quite convince. His voice had aged, yes, but the wear came from something more than time. He stood under the stained glass window, not one of saints or martyrs, but of anonymous scholars, cloaked in abstraction. Fitting, I thought. His set ended with a new piece, or new to the audience at least. I had heard its shape before. He began. The rope was drawn, but not the sound. She climbed alone to sacred ground. The smallest bell refused the hour, and silence bloomed in place of power. There was no applause. Not yet. The audience wasn't sure whether he had finished, and perhaps he hadn't. Later, I found him alone by the old stacks, his coat draped over the arm of a chair as though he had considered staying longer. I said little at first. Ambrose filled the silence with half smiles and mutterings about acoustics. I asked who had given him the image, the bell refusing the hour. He didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me a folded sheet, not typed, not printed, but written in ink that had begun to feather. The bell that never rang was mine. A gift of silence, bought in time. A voice too near, a hand too still, I pressed the hush and broke the will. He looked at me then, and I recognized the look. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was the absence of resistance, the sort of resignation that follows long acquaintance with memory. I told him Beatrice had meant to ring misericord, not for performance, for witness. He nodded. She said she would tell it for Kersey, he murmured. For the part of him they tried to erase, for the falsified report, the anonymous letter, the silence enforced by promotion and polite forgetting. He said it softly, but not hesitantly, as if he had rehearsed it often enough in private to finally speak it aloud. He said he hadn't meant to harm her, that she had been tired, that the medication was already there, that the line between sleep and surrender is finer than most people realize. I didn't believe him. Not entirely, but I didn't press. Some truths, once spoken, do not require interrogation. They merely echo. I asked about the poem in her diary, the musical fragment. He said Kersey had written it. Long ago, before his fall, before the review, before the lectures stopped, the bell rope was severed. He had given it to Beatrice as a gesture of trust, perhaps, or warning. He never meant for it to surface again, Ambrose added. Some things are kinder left unheard. We stood for a while in the hush of the library. Dust drifted in the slanting light like quiet punctuation. Ambrose asked what I would do with his poem. I said I didn't know yet. He smiled, thinly, said it was always the case, with poetry, with justice. I left him there, between shelves, framed by books and the faint sound of the librarian's steps on the mezzanine above. Outside, the city breathed evening. Bells tolled the hour, the large ones, the bold ones. But not misericord. Not yet. I returned to my flat and poured a measure of whiskey I didn't really want. The crossword lay open on the table. 3 letters. Soundless admission. I wrote, Nod. It fit. It rained the morning the college made it official. Not the hard theatrical sort of rain. That would have felt earned, even operatic. No, this was something lighter, grayer, the sort that seems to hang in the air without falling, as if weather itself had grown indifferent to the idea of consequence. Beatrice's name appeared in the minutes of the governing body under other business. 3 lines. A note of appreciation, years of service, a recommendation for a small brass plaque near the bursar's office, pending approval. No mention of towers or ropes or silences preserved in ink. The secretary read it aloud in the same tone he might have used for a misfiled invoice. No one objected. No one lingered. The meeting broke with the rustle of robes and the dull scrape of chairs against floorboards. I remained seated long after the room had emptied, watching the rain trace hesitant rivulets down the old mullioned windows. The city outside was blurred. I remember thinking how perfectly the glass had captured the mood of forgetting. Lewis waited by the door. He didn't say anything. He knows me well enough now. Later, I walked through the cloisters and paused by the chapel, where the bell tower loomed above like a half-remembered line from a poem. I thought again of the rope, long gone, of the copper wire, of Beatrice's steps on that narrow stairwell, each one chosen, not for justice, a word I've never trusted, but for something quieter, a reckoning perhaps, a private bell for a private sorrow. The porter passed me a manila envelope as I reached the lodge, said it had been left anonymously. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, old, creased from having been folded too long. A note in a familiar hand. Curses. She carries the toll now. The bell is silent because she is not. No signature. No date. Just those words. And beneath them, a penciled drawing of the chapel tower, rendered with surprising precision. I stared at it longer than I should have, as if the shape of the roof might give up a secret I'd missed. Back at my flat, I placed it beside her diary, Ambrose's poem, the photograph, and the letter from Vale. A silent archive of a silence that had lasted too long. I did not report the envelope. There was nothing to pursue, no charge to file. Sometimes what remains is not evidence, but residue. I made tea, real tea, not the dark bitterness I usually pretend is enough, and sat by the window, watching the street below. People moved with umbrellas and purpose. The world continued, as it always does, on the periphery of what matters. On my desk, the crossword waited. I hadn't touched it since Ambrose's recital. 3 clues left, 5 letters. Memories wait. I tried ghost, number, then trace. Closer, but not quite. I settled on stain. It fit, not just the puzzle, but the shape of the week. Something left behind. Unwanted, perhaps. Unforgotten. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and watched it burn itself down to silence. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Clear. Measured. But not misericord. That one remained silent, as the college had as they preferred. And I wondered if that was the final note after all, not guilt, not grief. Just the steady forgetting of a place that remembers only what flatters it. The bookshop had no name. Or if it did, it had long since faded from the glass above the door. A shop for the absent-minded and the chronically nostalgic, the kind of place that smells of yellowing paper and once-worn tweed. I didn't mean to go in. I rarely do. These are not destinations. There are pauses. Places that let the mind wander where it dares not walk. I wasn't looking for anything. Or I was, but didn't yet know its name. There's a difference. It was in the poetry section, between a spine-cracked Auden and a volume of Donne, whose dust jacket had long since decamped. Echoes and Silence by J.F. Ambrose. The same edition Beatrice had shelved above her blotter, spine pristine, its pages unread or too carefully read. I pulled it down, not for the poem. I knew that one now, but for the possibility of marginalia. Beatrice had that sort of mind. Not showy, but meticulous. The kind that left breadcrumbs only when she wanted someone to follow. I flipped carefully, listening to the rustle of pages like footsteps across linoleum. For a while, there was nothing. Just verse, pretentious in its restraint. Then, halfway through, the page where Ambrose compared bells to breath and regret to dust. I found it. A line underlined in pencil, faint but deliberate. Truth lives longest in silence. And just below it, in the margin, her handwriting. But not forever. No flourish. No signature, just the certainty of a woman who had waited long enough. I stood with the book for a long time. The shopkeeper glanced at me but said nothing. I paid in coins. Notes would have felt too modern, too impersonal. I walked out with the book tucked into my coat, not because it was cold, but because it deserved shelter. Oxford that day had the look of a city trying to forget it had once mattered. Leaves stuck to the stones. The bells were late. Or perhaps I was early. It's difficult to tell with time when silence has taken the measure of things. I passed the chapel. I didn't intend to stop, but something kept me. A sound, not the usual ring. A softer tone, a half-chime, uncertain of its own purpose. I stepped beneath the tower and looked up. The bell ropes had been replaced. 4 of them now. All visible. All waiting. I asked the porter when Misericord had been restrung. He said only this morning. Maintenance had arrived unannounced. Said the orders had come from above. Which above he didn't specify. That's how colleges function. Decisions descend like weather, originless and unquestioned. He said they'd tested the rope once, just to check. I asked if anyone had heard it ring. He paused, thought, then nodded vaguely. Said it was faint, but it was there. I walked on. Back at home, I placed the book beside her diary. Not with reverence. I have too little of that left. But with care. Paper deserves dignity, even when people forget how to give it. The crossword lay unfinished. A last clue stared up at me. 6 letters. Something buried, yet alive. I thought of a secret. Too easy. Then memory. Too long. I wrote truth. It fit. It wasn't perfect, but then neither was the world. I lit the last of the cigarettes from the pack I told myself I'd stop buying and watched the smoke coil toward the ceiling like a thought you hope not to finish. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, and for the first time in weeks, I thought I heard the smallest bell. Not loud, not clear, but undeniably there.